a crisp autumn morning, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The air carried a slight chill, but it was the kind of day that made you want to be outside, breathing in the fresh breeze. Out on the calm waters near Maryland's coastline, a man stood quietly at the helm of his modest yet well-kept yacht. This wasn't just any man. He was someone who had spent decades serving his country with honor. A decorated Navy admiral known for leading missions under pressure and earning respect across the globe, he was finally taking some time off. For once, there were no urgent briefings, no calls from headquarters, and no responsibilities weighing him down. He was simply enjoying a peaceful weekend away from all the chaos. Fishing had always been his escape, a way to clear his mind and reconnect with himself. His boat, which he lovingly called the Resolute, was more than just a vessel. It was a sanctuary where he could think, relax, and reflect on life. As the Admiral cast his line into the water, he felt a sense of tranquility wash over him. The rhythmic sound of waves lapping against the sides of the boat blended perfectly with the distant cries of seagulls overhead. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved being out on the open water so much. Everything seemed perfect, until something unexpected happened. Unbeknownst to him, an anonymous tip had reached the U.S. Coast Guard earlier that morning. Someone had reported seeing a suspicious black man aboard a private yacht near the marina. There weren't many details, no description of illegal activity or anything concrete, but the report was enough to raise eyebrows. In today's world, even vague tips can lead to action, especially when it comes to maritime security. So, without hesitation, the Coast Guard dispatched a patrol boat to investigate further. From afar, the Admiral noticed the approaching patrol boat. At first, he didn't think much of it. Boats passing by weren't uncommon, and he assumed this was just another routine check. After all, he'd been through countless inspections during his years in the Navy. But as the patrol boat drew closer, its intentions became clearer. The Coast Guardsmen on board signaled for him to stop, and soon they were pulling up alongside the Resolute. The Admiral watched calmly as two officers climbed aboard his yacht. They were young, likely fresh out of training, and their body language suggested they meant business. One of them immediately asked for identification, while the other began scanning the deck with sharp eyes. The Admiral handed over his ID without hesitation, expecting the matter to be resolved quickly. Little did he know, things were about to take a turn he never anticipated. What started as a simple fishing trip was about to become a lesson in patience, dignity, and standing firm in the face of misunderstanding. For now, though, the Admiral remained composed, unsure of what exactly was happening, but confident that everything would work itself out. Yet deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about how the officers were behaving. Their questions felt oddly pointed, almost accusatory, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. And as the minutes ticked by, the tension aboard the Resolute grew thicker, setting the stage for what would become an unforgettable chapter in his life. The moment the Coast Guard officers stepped onto the Resolute, the atmosphere shifted. The calm and peaceful vibe that had filled the yacht just moments ago was replaced by a tense, uneasy energy. One of the officers, clearly trying to assert authority, demanded identification with a tone that felt more accusatory than polite. The Admiral, still standing at the helm, handed over his driver's license without hesitation. He also produced the registration papers for the boat, thinking it would quickly resolve whatever concern they had. But instead of easing their suspicions, the documents seemed to raise even more questions. One of the officers glanced at the name on the ID, then looked back at the man in front of him as if searching for something that didn't add up. "This is your boat?" he asked, skepticism dripping from every word. "Yes," the Admiral replied calmly, meeting the officer's gaze. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet firmness that came from years of commanding respect in high-pressure situations. "I've owned it for years." The officer wasn't satisfied. He gestured toward the sleek design of the yacht, its polished woodwork and well-maintained equipment. "Do you know how much a boat like this costs?" he said, almost challenging. "It doesn't seem like the kind of thing someone like you would own." The comment landed heavily, and though the Admiral didn't react outwardly, it stung. He knew exactly what the officer meant by someone like you. It wasn't about his financial status or whether he could afford a yacht. It was about the color of his skin. For a brief moment, anger flickered inside him, but he pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time to lose his composure. Instead, he responded with measured words. I assure you, this is my property. I'm here legally and I haven't done anything wrong. Despite his calm demeanor, the officers weren't ready to let go. They insisted on conducting a search of the yacht, citing vague security protocols and the need to ensure no illegal activity was taking place. The Admiral, knowing full well that resisting would only escalate things further, nodded reluctantly. Go ahead, he said, stepping back to give them space. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. As the officers began rummaging through his belongings, opening compartments and inspecting every corner of the boat, the Admiral stood silently, watching them with growing frustration. Every drawer they opened, every item they moved, felt like an invasion, not just of his personal space but of his dignity. This wasn't just some random civilian being questioned. This was a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, someone who had earned the highest ranks within the Navy. And yet, here he was, treated as if he were guilty until proven innocent. The search dragged on longer than necessary, each passing minute amplifying the tension. When one of the officers found a small tackle box containing fishing gear, he held it up triumphantly, as though it might somehow be evidence of wrongdoing. What's this for? He asked, his tone implying there must be more to it. It's fishing equipment, the Admiral replied dryly. I'm out here to fish, remember? The other officer smirked, exchanging a glance with his partner before turning back to the Admiral. You sure about that? Because we've had reports of suspicious activity around here. Suspicious activity? The Admiral repeated, raising an eyebrow. From who? And based on what? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Neither officer seemed willing, or perhaps able, to provide any concrete details. Their actions spoke louder than their words. They were operating on assumptions guided by biases rather than facts. The Admiral could see it clearly now. This wasn't about following protocol or ensuring safety. It was about prejudice disguised as procedure. When the search finally concluded and nothing incriminating was found, the officers appeared visibly frustrated. They had expected to uncover something, anything that might justify their suspicions. But the yacht was clean, just as the Admiral had claimed. Still, instead of apologizing or admitting fault, one of them tried a different tactic. Look, he said gruffly, if you're hiding something, now's the time to come clean. Obstruction of justice is a serious charge. At that point, the Admiral couldn't stay silent anymore. He took a step forward, his posture straightening as he drew himself up to his full height. His eyes locked onto the officers, unwavering and sharp. Obstruction of justice? He echoed, his voice low but carrying weight. Let me remind you, I've been cooperative from the start. You've searched my boat, checked my credentials, and found absolutely nothing. So tell me, exactly what am I obstructing? The officer hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. The Admiral's words carried authority, the kind that comes not from yelling or aggression but from confidence and truth. For the first time since boarding the yacht, the officers seemed uncertain. They exchanged another glance, their earlier bravado fading into discomfort. Realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, the lead officer attempted to backtrack. We're just doing our job, he muttered defensively. Someone called in a tip and we have to follow up. A tip? The Admiral shot back, his voice rising slightly. Based on what? My race? The fact that I happen to own a nice boat? That's not good enough. If you're going to accuse someone of something, you'd better have real evidence, not baseless assumptions. The silence that followed was deafening. The officers shuffled awkwardly, avoiding eye contact as the reality of the situation sank in. What had started as a routine investigation had turned into something far more complicated and revealing. The Admiral's patience was wearing thin, But he refused to let his emotions get the better of him. He knew losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he chose to wait, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead officer cleared his throat. "We'll, wrap this up," he said, signaling to his partner to gather their things. "Sorry for the inconvenience." The apology sounded hollow, forced, and entirely insufficient. As the officers prepared to leave, the Admiral watched them closely, his expression unreadable. He didn't say another word, but his silence spoke volumes. This encounter wasn't over, not for him. It was a moment that would linger in his mind long after the patrol boat disappeared into the distance, leaving behind ripples of unease on the otherwise serene waters. For the Admiral, the experience was a stark reminder of the challenges faced by countless individuals who looked like him. Despite his rank, his accomplishments, and his service to the nation, he wasn't immune to judgment based on appearances. It was a sobering realization, one that would soon inspire him to take action, not just for himself, but for others who didn't have the platform to speak out. But for now, as he stood alone on the Resolute, the quiet hum of the waves offered little comfort. The Coast Guard officers were already halfway back to their patrol boat when the Admiral made a decision. He couldn't let this moment pass without addressing what had just happened. It wasn't about pride or ego. It was about accountability. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of something much bigger, something that needed to be acknowledged and confronted. So, before they could fully retreat, he called out, "Wait," he said firmly, his voice cutting through. The quiet tension hanging over the water, the two officers froze mid-step, turning slowly to face him. Their expressions were a mix of apprehension and confusion. They likely expected another rebuke, but instead, the Admiral reached into his wallet and pulled out not just his civilian ID but also his military credentials, a small card encased in plastic, bearing the unmistakable insignia of a 4-star admiral in the United States Navy. He held it up for them to see, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his tone calm but commanding. For a split second, there was silence. Then one of the officers leaned closer, squinting at the badge. His eyes widened as recognition dawned, followed quickly by disbelief. Is this real?" he stammered, glancing between the Admiral and the document in his hand. "It's real," the Admiral replied simply, his gaze unwavering. "And I outrank nearly everyone in your chain of command. If the situation hadn't already been tense, it became electrified in that instant." The officers exchanged panicked looks, their earlier bravado crumbling under the realization of who they were dealing with. One of them instinctively straightened his posture, while the other fumbled awkwardly with his radio. Neither spoke immediately, struggling to process how they had managed to misjudge the situation so completely. Finally, the lead officer found his voice. "Sir, we didn't know," he began, stumbling over his words. "We were just following protocol based on the tip we received. We didn't mean any disrespect." The Admiral studied them carefully, his expression unreadable. On one hand, he understood that these young men were likely following orders, doing what they thought was necessary to protect national security. But on the other hand, their actions, and the underlying assumptions that drove them, were deeply troubling. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and walk away. There had to be accountability. "You say you were following protocol," the Admiral said after a pause, his voice steady but firm. "But tell me, does protocol dictate that you treat every citizen the same way you've treated me today? Does it allow you to profile someone based on nothing more than their appearance?" The question hung heavy in the air, forcing the officers to confront the uncomfortable truth. They shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact as they struggled to respond. The lead officer finally muttered, "No, sir. That's not what we're supposed to do." "Then why did it happen?" The Admiral pressed, his tone softer now but still probing. "Why did you assume I was guilty before even asking me a single question? Why did you search my boat like you expected to find something illegal?" There was no easy answer to those questions, and both officers knew it. After a long pause, the lead officer sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know, sir," he admitted, quietly. "We got a call about suspicious activity and we came here to investigate. I guess we jumped to conclusions too fast." The Admiral nodded slowly, accepting the admission for what it was, an honest acknowledgement of error. Still, he wasn't satisfied. "It's not just about today," he said. "This isn't the first time someone has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. And unless people like you start recognizing the biases that drive decisions like this, it won't be the last." His words carried a weight that went beyond the immediate situation. This wasn't just about him or the Coast Guard. It was about a systemic issue that affected countless lives every day. The officers stood silently, absorbing the gravity of his message. For the first time since boarding the Resolute, they seemed genuinely remorseful. After a few moments, the lead officer extended a hesitant hand. "Sir, I want to apologize again," he said sincerely. "What happened here was wrong, and I take full responsibility. We'll make sure this doesn't
happen again."
The Admiral looked at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. "Apologies are important," he said, "but actions matter more. If you truly mean what you're saying, then use this experience to change how you approach situations like this in the future. Don't let assumptions cloud your judgment." With that, the officers climbed back onto their patrol boat, leaving the Admiral alone once more. As they motored away, he watched them disappear into the distance, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. His rank had forced them to recognize their mistake, but another part of him felt weary. Being an admiral shouldn't have been necessary to earn basic respect. He sat down heavily on the deck of the Resolute, staring out at the endless expanse of water. The peacefulness he had felt earlier that morning was gone, replaced by a simmering frustration. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who didn't wear uniforms or carry badges that could command respect. How many others had faced similar treatment without the platform to speak out? How many times had prejudice disguised itself as procedure? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shimmering reflections across the waves, the Admiral resolved to do something about it. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could channel his anger and disappointment into action. This encounter would not become just another forgotten blip in his life. Instead, it would serve as a catalyst for change, a reminder that leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about standing up for what was right even when it was hard. By the time he picked up his fishing rod again, his resolve was clear. He wouldn't let this incident define him, but he would use it to redefine the conversation around bias and fairness. Because if someone in his position could be subjected to such treatment, then the work ahead was far from done. And he was, ready to step up and lead, not just on the battlefield but in the fight for justice and equality. The fallout from the incident spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Word of what had happened on the Resolute reached the media within hours, thanks to a local fisherman who had witnessed part of the confrontation and couldn't resist sharing it online. What started as a vague post about a guy getting hassled by the Coast Guard quickly evolved into a full-blown story when someone recognized the yacht's owner, a decorated Navy admiral. Social media lit up with outrage, and soon major news outlets were scrambling to cover the developing scandal. For the Admiral, the sudden attention was overwhelming. He hadn't sought publicity or drama. He'd simply wanted answers and accountability. But now, his face was plastered across television screens, newspapers, and websites. Reporters camped outside his home, eager for a statement. Lawmakers demanded investigations. Activists hailed him as a symbol of resilience in the face of systemic bias. While some saw his story as an opportunity to shine a light on racial profiling, others criticized the Coast Guard for its handling of the situation, calling it a glaring example of institutional failure. Amidst the chaos, the Coast Guard issued a public apology, emphasizing that the officers involved had acted on an anonymous tip and not out of malice. They promised reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future, including additional training on implicit bias and improved protocols for responding to vague reports. But for many, the apology rang hollow. Critics argued that such statements were easy to make but far harder to back up with meaningful action. The Admiral himself remained cautious, aware that words alone wouldn't bring about real change. In the days following the incident, the Admiral found himself reflecting deeply on what had happened and what it meant. At first he felt anger, frustration, and even embarrassment. Despite his rank and accomplishments, he had been reduced to a stereotype, judged not by his character but by the color of his skin. It was a sobering reminder that no amount of success could shield him, or anyone else, from prejudice. But as the initial shock wore off, those feelings gave way to something else. Determination. He began reaching out to people he trusted, friends, colleagues, mentors, to discuss how best to use this moment to drive positive change. One evening, sitting in his study surrounded by books and memorabilia from his decades of service, he drafted a plan. The goal was simple yet ambitious: to address the root causes of racial bias in law enforcement and create pathways for accountability and understanding. His first step was to file a formal complaint against the Coast Guard, not out of vengeance, but to ensure the incident was documented and taken seriously. He knew that holding individuals accountable was only part of the solution. The bigger challenge lay in changing the culture that allowed such biases to persist. To tackle this, he partnered with several civil rights organizations, leveraging their expertise and networks to amplify his message. Together, they launched a nationwide initiative called Respect and Reform. The program focused on two key areas: education and advocacy. On the education front, workshops and seminars were organized to train law enforcement personnel on recognizing and combating unconscious bias. These sessions weren't designed to shame or blame, but rather to foster empathy and awareness. Officers learned through interactive scenarios and open discussions, gaining insights into how assumptions can shape their interactions with the public. For advocacy, the initiative worked to promote diversity within law enforcement agencies, pushing for policies that encouraged inclusion at every level of hiring and promotion. As news of respect and reform gained traction, invitations poured in for the Admiral to speak publicly about his experience. He accepted several, knowing that sharing his story could inspire others to take action. His speeches were powerful not because of flashy rhetoric, but because of their honesty. He spoke candidly about the pain of being profiled, the frustration of having to prove his worth despite his achievements, and the responsibility he felt to advocate for those without a voice. One particularly memorable speech took place before a packed auditorium at a national civil rights conference. Standing behind the podium, dressed in civilian clothes, he began by acknowledging the irony of his position. "I've spent my entire career serving this country," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've led missions, made tough decisions, and earned the respect of my peers. Yet none of that mattered when I stepped onto my own boat one morning. All that mattered was the color of my skin." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He continued, "What happened to me isn't unique. It's a reflection of a larger problem, one that affects millions of people every day. And while I'm fortunate enough to have a platform to speak out, most aren't. That's why we need to do better, not just as individuals, but as a society." By the time he finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. People approached him afterward, thanking him for his courage and sharing their own stories of discrimination. Each encounter reinforced his belief that change was possible, but only if people were willing to listen, learn, and act. Back home, the Admiral also took steps to engage with younger generations. He visited schools and community centers, talking to students about leadership, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what's right. During one visit, a high school student asked him how he stayed calm during the confrontation with the Coast Guard. His answer was simple: "Because losing my temper wouldn't have solved anything. Sometimes strength isn't about fighting back. It's about staying composed and showing others the kind of person you are." Slowly but surely, the Admiral's efforts began to bear fruit. The Coast Guard announced new measures aimed at addressing racial bias, including stricter oversight of anonymous tips and mandatory diversity training for all personnel. Other branches of law enforcement followed suit, inspired by the growing momentum around reform. While progress was slow and incremental, it was undeniable. Yet even as accolades poured in and praise-filled headlines, the Admiral remained grounded. He knew that true change required patience, persistence, and collaboration. There would be setbacks along the way, moments when progress seemed impossible. But he refused to lose sight of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about creating a world where everyone, regardless of race or background, could live free from judgment and fear. Late one night, after a long day of meetings and interviews, the Admiral returned to the Resolute. He stood at the helm, gazing out at the dark waters illuminated by the moonlight. The yacht, once a symbol of peace and escape, now represented something greater: resilience, hope, and the power of turning adversity into action. As he leaned against the railing, he allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. After all, leading through difficult times was what he had always done best. The Admiral's journey didn't stop with speeches, workshops, or partnerships. As the momentum behind respect and reform grew, he realized that real change often required more than grassroots efforts. It needed systemic reinforcement. That meant taking his message directly to the people who could influence policy at the highest levels: lawmakers. So, when Congress announced a hearing on racial bias in law enforcement and national security agencies, the Admiral decided it was time to step into the spotlight once again. Preparing for his testimony wasn't easy. He spent hours poring over notes, rehearsing what he wanted to say, and thinking about how to frame his experience in a way that would resonate with both politicians and the public. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of their race. He knew his words had the potential to spark meaningful change, or fall flat if not delivered thoughtfully. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he reminded himself why he was doing this: to ensure no one else had to endure what he went through. On the day of the hearing, the room buzzed with anticipation. Lawmakers, journalists, and spectators filled the chamber, eager to hear firsthand from someone whose story had captured national attention. When the Admiral walked in, dressed in a crisp suit, there was an immediate hush. Cameras flashed as he took his seat at the witness table, his posture upright and composed. Despite the scrutiny, he exuded calm confidence, the kind that comes from knowing your purpose. When it was his turn to speak, he began by recounting the events of that fateful morning on the Resolute. His tone was measured, almost conversational, as if he were sharing the story with a close friend rather than addressing a packed congressional hall. "It started like any other day," he said, pausing briefly to let the audience picture the scene. "I was out on my boat enjoying some rare peace and quiet after years of service to this country. But within minutes, I found myself facing assumptions and accusations based solely on my appearance." He went on to describe the Coast Guard officers' behavior, the skeptical questions, the invasive search, the thinly veiled insinuations, and how those actions made him feel. "I've faced danger before," he explained. "I've led missions where lives were on the line, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of being treated as guilty until proven innocent, not because of anything I'd done, but because of the color of my skin." His voice never wavered, but the emotion behind his words was palpable. Some lawmakers leaned forward in their seats, visibly moved. Others nodded solemnly, recognizing the gravity of what they were hearing. By the time he revealed his rank during the confrontation, the room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and anger. One senator shook her head, muttering, "This shouldn't happen to anyone, let alone someone of your stature." But the Admiral wasn't looking for sympathy. Instead, he used the moment to pivot toward solutions. "My story isn't unique," he emphasized. "What makes it stand out is that I have a platform to share it. Millions of others face similar treatment every day without the means to fight back. If we want to create lasting change, we need policies that hold institutions accountable, not just individuals." He outlined several concrete recommendations ranging from mandatory bias training for all law enforcement personnel to the creation of independent oversight boards tasked with reviewing anonymous tips and complaints. He also advocated for greater transparency, urging agencies to release data on stops, searches, and arrests broken down by race. "Numbers don't lie," he said firmly. "They'll show us exactly where the problems are so we can address them." As he wrapped up his testimony, the Admiral looked directly at the panel of lawmakers. "You have the power to make things right," he told them. "But laws and policies are only as strong as the people enforcing them. We need leadership that prioritizes fairness and justice above all else. And we need communities to trust that their leaders will protect them, not target them." The room erupted into applause, and several lawmakers approached him afterward to express their gratitude. One even admitted, "Your courage has opened my eyes to issues I hadn't fully understood before." For the Admiral, moments like these reinforced the importance of speaking up, even when it felt uncomfortable or risky. In the weeks following the hearing, the impact of his testimony became undeniable. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at implementing many of the reforms he had proposed. Advocacy groups rallied around his ideas, using them as blueprints for campaigns across the country. Even the Coast Guard itself doubled down on its commitment to change, announcing new initiatives to improve accountability and community relations. But the Admiral didn't rest on his laurels. He knew that passing laws and issuing statements were only the beginning. Real progress would require sustained effort, years if not decades of consistent work. To keep the momentum going, he continued traveling the country, meeting with local leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens. Everywhere he went, he listened as much as he spoke, gathering stories and insights that helped shape the next phase of respect and reform. One particularly memorable visit took him to a small coastal town where tensions between residents and law enforcement had reached a boiling point. A young woman stood up during a community meeting and shared her own experience of being stopped while driving home late at night. "I wasn't speeding, I wasn't swerving, I was just trying to get home," she said, her voice trembling. "But they pulled me over anyway, asked me where I was coming from, like I didn't belong here." Her words struck a chord with the Admiral. Afterward, he pulled her aside and thanked her for having the courage to speak out. "Stories like yours remind me why we're doing this," he told her. "Change starts with people willing to share their truth, even when it's hard." By the end of the year, the initiative had grown beyond anything the Admiral had initially imagined. What began as a personal mission had transformed into a nationwide movement, uniting people from all walks of life under a shared goal to build a fairer, more equitable society. Yet despite the accolades and milestones, he remained humble. "This isn't about me," he often reminded those who praised him. "It's about all of us working together to create something better." Late one evening, as he sat alone on the Resolute, watching the stars reflect off the water, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey ahead was long, and challenges undoubtedly lay in wait. But for the first time in a while, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that his efforts and the collective efforts of so many others were planting seeds of change. Seeds that, with care and persistence, might one day grow into something transformative. Years passed, and the Admiral eventually reached the point in his life where retirement became inevitable. After decades of service, first to the Navy and later to the cause of justice, he decided it was time to step back and let others carry the torch. But stepping away didn't mean fading into obscurity. If anything, his legacy only grew stronger with time, becoming a beacon of inspiration for countless individuals across the nation. The yacht, the Resolute, remained docked at the same marina where the infamous incident had occurred. It wasn't just a boat anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Visitors often stopped by to see it, drawn not by its sleek design or polished woodwork but by the story behind it. Some came out of curiosity, while others sought solace or motivation. The Admiral welcomed them all, sharing pieces of his journey whenever someone asked. He never sought to glorify himself. Instead, He used these moments to remind people that change begins with courage, the courage to stand firm in the face of injustice, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. One sunny afternoon, a group of high school students visited the marina as part of a field trip organized by their history teacher. They gathered around the Resolute, listening intently as the Admiral recounted the events of that autumn morning years ago. His voice carried warmth and wisdom, drawing the teenagers in despite their initial skepticism. At first, they were quiet, unsure of what to say. But as the story unfolded, questions began pouring out. "Weren't you scared?" one boy asked hesitantly. The Admiral chuckled softly before answering. "Of course I was," he admitted. "But fear doesn't have to control us. Sometimes it can push us to do the right thing, even if it's hard." Another student raised her hand. "Do you think things have gotten better since then?" He paused, considering the question carefully. "Progress isn't always easy to measure," he said finally. "There are good days and bad ones, but I believe we're moving in the right direction. More people are speaking up, more leaders are listening, and more communities are working together. That gives me hope." By the end of the visit, the students left inspired, buzzing with ideas about how they could make a difference in their own lives. Their teacher thanked the Admiral, telling him how much his words meant to her class. "You've given them something to believe in," she said sincerely. "And that's priceless." As the years went on, the Admiral's story found its way into textbooks, documentaries, and even museum exhibits dedicated to civil rights and social justice. Educators used his experience to teach lessons about systemic bias, leadership, and the power of advocacy. Students learned not just about the man himself, but about the broader issues his story highlighted. In classrooms across the country, debates sparked over how far society had come and how much further it still needed to go. Even in retirement, the Admiral stayed active, mentoring young leaders and supporting grassroots initiatives aimed at fostering equality. He believed deeply in the next generation, seeing in them a determination and creativity that gave him confidence about the future. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often told them. "It takes patience, persistence, and teamwork, but every small step matters." His presence continued to inspire those around him, whether through formal speeches or casual conversations. One day, while walking along the marina, he struck up a chat with a young fisherman who recognized him immediately. "I heard your story online," the man said shyly. "It made me realize I shouldn't stay silent when I see unfairness happening. Thanks for showing me that standing up for what's right is worth it, no matter how tough it gets." Moments like these reminded the Admiral why he'd chosen to share his story so openly. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about creating ripples of change that would spread far beyond his lifetime. Every person he touched, every mind he opened, carried forward the mission he'd started years ago. And yet, despite all the accolades and admiration, the Admiral remained grounded. He lived modestly, finding joy in simple pleasures: fishing, trips on the Resolute, quiet evenings reading books and spending time with family and friends. Those close to him knew he valued authenticity above all else. He didn't care for titles or honors. What mattered most to him was making a difference, however small. On his final fishing trip aboard the Resolute, the Admiral reflected on everything he'd experienced. The water was calm, mirroring the serenity he felt within. He thought about the challenges he'd faced, the battles he'd fought, and the victories, both big and small, that had shaped his path. There were times when doubt crept in, when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to bear. But through it all, he had held on to one truth: progress was possible, but it required effort from everyone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the waves, the Admiral smiled to himself. He hadn't set out to be a hero or a trailblazer. He had simply done what he believed was right, trusting that others would join him in the fight for fairness and dignity. And they had, not just during his lifetime, but long after. When the Admiral passed away peacefully in his sleep years later, tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Politicians praised his leadership, activists celebrated his advocacy, and ordinary citizens shared how his story had touched their lives. Memorials were held not just in his honor but in recognition of the movement he had helped ignite. The Resolute was preserved as a floating museum, open to anyone who wanted to learn about the man and the values he stood for. Today, visitors continue to flock to the marina, eager to connect with the spirit of resilience and hope embodied by the yacht and its owner. Parents bring their children, teachers bring their students, and activists bring their allies, all united by a shared desire to build a better world. For many, the experience is transformative, reminding them that even in the face of adversity, one person's actions can spark a chain reaction of positive change. The Admiral may no longer be here physically, but his legacy endures, in the policies that promote fairness, in the voices that speak out against injustice, and in the hearts of those who refuse to give up on the dream of equality. His story serves as a powerful reminder that true leadership isn't about titles or ranks. It's about standing firm in your convictions, lifting others up, and leaving the world a little brighter than you found it.